What's up everyone, and welcome back to another episode on this channel. In this one we're finally back with the Volvo. I know a lot of you have been asking about it, so here it is. I've been driving a bit during the winter, drifting around a little bit in the snow, but recently I've run into a couple of problems, and that is with the starter. It has some starting issues when it's cold, so we will dive into that. And also the fan inside of the car has stopped working. All of a sudden it just smelled very burnt in the car, and the fan did not work. And obviously you need to have that when you're driving around in the winter, or else the inside of the windows are just going to be fogged up and iced up. And then I actually have a lot of parts to change on this car, just maintenance stuff and some upgrades, but I will have to save that for the next episode because it will just be too much to cover in this episode. So in this one we're gonna take care of the more acute problems, but before we do that, let's take the car inside and give it a quick wash because it's quite filthy right now, so let's get right to it. As for the starting problem, when it's really cold outside, it clicks the first few attempts and then eventually it starts up. More on that later on in the video. The fan has been working on and off lately erratically, but when it was really cold outside it stopped working altogether. And if the resistor is bad, it usually still works on the highest setting, but the last time I checked it didn't work at all. So there we go, the car is now finally presentable and we can go ahead and dive into the fault finding. And I'm gonna begin with the fan inside of the car. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So for all of you Volvo experts out there, shouldn't there be a cover here underneath the glove box? Because as it is on my car, I can just access the fan and the resistor from right there. And it even looks like something is supposed to be attached to this right here. So if there's anyone who knows, please let me know. But anyways, let's go ahead and troubleshoot this whole thing. Oh boy. Well, I guess we found our problem. As we can see, the fan works right now, so my first guess is that it was some ice buildup in the fan which prohibited it from working. So let's disassemble it, clean it all together and see if I can find any visual damage. The motor spins nice and freely, the windings looks to be okay, the brushes still has meat on them, so I think this motor with a cleanup and no water and ice blockage will last a lot more years to come. The motor itself I'm carefully cleaning with a nylon brush and then carefully blowing it out with some compressed air. And for the housing, that I'm gonna be cleaning with some cleaning agents and running water. course, after the housing has dried fully, it's time to reassemble it. But before we call it quits on the fan, I still want to check out the resistor and do some quick measurements and see if there's anything obvious going wrong with it. This right here is the thermo fuse, which often can go bad on these resistors, and you can replace them separately because it's really hard to find a new resistor on these old Volvos. But in my case it was fine. The only thing I noticed was that the connections were a bit crusty, so I sprayed them down with some dedicated electrical cleaner and protectant. So the fan is working perfectly right now. As you saw, disassembled everything, and I've did a couple of more measurements off camera, and everything seems to be working perfectly. Actually, if the resistor or the fan really goes bad, you can't actually buy them new, which is a shame because they are discontinued, and more parts are discontinued for these old beautiful Volvos, which is a shame, I think. So if you have an actual faulty resistor or fan, you need to rebuild it or buy a used one. But mine is working right now as it should. So what probably happened was that water was collecting there because there was so much snow on the car. I've checked the drains, they're not clogged, so water must have collected there, and then it must have frozen because it was cold outside, and the electric motor was stuck. But power was trying to flow through it, and that's probably why it got really hot, and it was smelling like burnt something in the car. So that's probably the smell that I felt, and it makes perfect sense when you think about it as well. So hopefully it will work fine from here on out. I will keep an eye on it, of course, but I am pretty confident that it will work as it should right now. But let's go and take care of the starter motor. Actually, of course, because I'm going to film right now and actually diagnose it for real, it worked perfectly when I did some measurements. It started right up, of course. I've noticed that it's mostly when it's really cold outside that the clicking happens, but it's not the battery per se, because it does start after a couple of tries. So what I'm thinking is that it's the solenoid that's starting to get bad. So yeah, I'll probably just go ahead and change the solenoid, because I've actually checked the power wire going all the way to the starter, and it's perfectly fine, no voltage drop there. And I've checked the ground side, and it's perfectly fine there as well. No voltage drop worth mentioning. I didn't check the signal wire when the problem occurred. Now it's working perfectly, of course, because it starts right up, but I didn't test it while the problem was present. But I think it's fine, because otherwise it wouldn't have clicked if no control signal went through there. So that just leaves me to think that the solenoid itself is starting to stick and getting old. So before we even go near the starter, let's go ahead and disconnect the battery. Speaking of the battery, that isn't actually the culprit of the problem, since it does in fact have enough juice to start the engine just fine, but it's at about 50% of its health and it's old, on its way out, so it's definitely not a bad idea to replace it with a new one. The starter on these old red block Volvos are super easy to replace. You actually don't need to remove anything in order to gain access to it, and it's just held on with two big 19mm bolts holding it onto the block or the transmission casing, and a 13mm nut holding on the power cable, and then just a small electrical connection that you need to remove. As we can see right now, when we bench test it, the starter is working as it should, but I'm still gonna disassemble it and see what I can do. You can actually come a really long way just by disassembling a starter, cleaning all of the internal parts, and re-lubricating all of the moving parts. That can actually make a starter feel like brand new again. This housing right here was so filthy. It was full of old grease, which had attracted a bunch of dirty particles, which obviously is not very good for an electrical motor. So after checking everything in this starter and everything looks okay, I actually talked to an expert in this field of electrical motors and alternators. And he said I described my symptoms and all of that, and he said what's most likely is that with old solenoids like this, it's very common for condensation and ice to form in here, which does not allow proper contact to occur. And that explains why when I tried to turn the key multiple times and it was clicking, eventually heat builds up and it melted away the ice and it could make some contact. And he said there's no point in trying to rebuild a solenoid. The best thing to do is to just buy a new one and the problem will most likely be solved. So that's what I will do. I would order a new solenoid. So a new solenoid is on the way, and probably in the next scene you will see the new solenoid right here. The by far most finicky part of reassembly of an electrical motor is to get the brushes onto the rotor. And a good tip right here is to use a socket from the other side and then just glide the rotor onto the socket and then onto the brushes from the other side. And that way you can actually start with a really small socket and then just work your way up to a socket that is the similar size to the rotor. Now after reconnecting the battery, let's see if the engine starts. It sure did. But the real test will be when it's really cold outside, so I'll keep you updated on that. But for now, the last thing to do in this video is to replace the battery, because I just bought a brand new one. And before any of my Swedish viewers cringe over the fact that I bought a Biltema battery, I can tell you that I've had good experience with them and they've actually lasted me a very long time considering the price that you pay for them. Even though the battery is brand new, it's always a good habit to make sure that they're fully 100% charged before you fit them to the vehicle. So out with the old and in with the new. So that is it for this video and the Volvo. The next time this will be on the channel, I will actually change a bunch of parts. I've got some boxes right there containing a lot of new parts that I'm gonna throw on the car. So stay tuned for that video. For this one, it was just fixing the most urgent problems so I can continue to drive it now during the winter. Feels really nice to have the battery sorted, and the starter, some heat in the cabin, because all of that is needed, especially now in the winter time. So sorry for not making this video super involved, but it still needed to be taken care of, and I thought, hey, I should make a video on it. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. Bye guys.